Pay attention to this. March 22nd, 2025. What you're about to see is not video footage, it's a single frame, one photograph extracted from a surveillance system that had been overwritten. But that one image would be enough to lead investigators to a woman who'd been missing for 11 days, and to the two men who'd taken her. Baltimore, Maryland. On March 11, 2025, Rebecca Hartman, 50, disappeared. She was a mother of two, a daughter, 14, and a son, 12. She was married to David Hartman, worked as a school administrator, lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Rebecca wasn't the type of person who just vanished. But on March 11th, that's exactly what happened. Rebecca had been home that afternoon. Her children were at school. Her husband was at work. Around 2 p.m., Rebecca texted her husband saying she was going to run errands. That was the last communication anyone had with her. When the children came home from school at 3:30 p.m., Rebecca wasn't there. When David arrived home from work at 6 p.m., Rebecca still wasn't there. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was in the house. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. Rebecca Hartman had vanished from her own home in the middle of the afternoon. Baltimore Police treated Rebecca's disappearance as high priority from the start. A woman doesn't leave her home without her phone, without her car, without telling anyone where she's going. Something had happened to her. Investigators interviewed the family, friends, neighbors. No one had seen Rebecca leave the house. No one had noticed anything unusual. The family had no enemies, no financial problems, no marital issues. There was no reason for Rebecca to disappear voluntarily. Police canvassed the neighborhood, checked security cameras from nearby homes and businesses. Nothing showed Rebecca leaving her property. Then, investigators learned something significant. 2 weeks before Rebecca disappeared, the Hartman family had hired contractors to do some renovation work on their home. The workers were two men who ran a small construction business, Mihai Ionescu, 45, and Vasile Dumitru, 38, immigrants from Romania who'd been in the United States for several years, built a client base through word of mouth. The men had been in the Hartman home multiple times over a 2-week period. They'd had access to the house, had been alone with Rebecca on several occasions when David and the children weren't home. Police located Ionescu and Dumitru and brought them in for questioning. Both men claimed they'd finished the work a week before Rebecca disappeared, hadn't been to the house since, had no idea what had happened to her. But investigators noted that both men seemed nervous. Their alibis for March 11th were vague, and when police searched their work van, they found something concerning. Strands of hair caught in the back door seal. DNA testing would later confirm the hair belonged to Rebecca Hartman. Ionescu and Dumitru were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. But without Rebecca, without a crime scene, without knowing where she was or what had been done to her, prosecutors couldn't build a strong case. They had hair in a van, but the men claimed Rebecca must have left it there during one of their visits to her home when they'd transported materials. Police needed more. They needed to find Rebecca. Investigators began mapping out locations connected to the two suspects. Where did they live? Where did they work? What properties did they have access to? One location stood out, an abandoned office building on the outskirts of Baltimore that was owned by a relative of Ionescu. The building had been vacant for years, was scheduled for demolition. But utility records showed that electricity had been turned on at the building 2 months earlier, around the time the suspects had started working at the Hartman home. Why would someone activate electricity in a building scheduled for demolition? Police obtained a warrant to search the building. When they entered, they found it was mostly empty. Old office furniture, debris, signs of decay. But they also found evidence that someone had been using the building recently. There were recent footprints in the dust, fresh trash in one of the rooms, and in the basement, they found a surveillance camera. The camera was old, the kind used in commercial buildings years ago. It was still plugged in, still technically operational, though its storage was full and had been overwriting itself for days. Technicians removed the camera and took it to the lab. They attempted to recover any footage that might remain. Most of it had been overwritten. But buried in the corrupted data, they found one intact frame, a single image. The image showed a woman standing just outside an elevator door. She appeared distressed, disheveled. Her expression was one of shock or fear. The woman was Rebecca Hartman. That single frame became the key piece of evidence. It proved Rebecca had been in that building. It proved she'd been held there. It gave investigators enough to return to the building and conduct a more thorough search. In the basement, investigators found a room that had been used as a makeshift cell. There was evidence of prolonged captivity. Forensic analysis found Rebecca's DNA throughout the room. There were also signs of violence, of trauma. But Rebecca wasn't there. The room was empty. Where had the suspects moved her? Confronted with the photograph and the forensic evidence from the basement room, Dumitru broke. He confessed to everything. He and Ionescu had become obsessed with Rebecca while working in her home. They'd planned to take her. On March 11th, they'd returned to the Hartman house under the pretense of checking on some detail of the finished work. Rebecca had let them in. They'd overpowered her, forced her into their van, and driven her to the abandoned office building. They'd kept her in that basement room for 11 days. During that time, they'd assaulted her repeatedly. They'd turned on electricity in the building specifically to power lights in the surveillance system. They'd wanted to watch her, to have control. The surveillance camera had been set up in the hallway outside the elevator, positioned to monitor movement in the basement. The single frame that had been recovered showed Rebecca at a moment when she'd apparently tried to escape from the room. She'd made it to the elevator before they'd caught her and forced her back. On March 21st, 10 days into her captivity, Rebecca had died from injuries sustained during the assaults. The suspects had panicked. They'd wrapped her body and moved it to a different location, a construction site where one of them had worked previously, burying her beneath concrete that was being poured for a foundation. Dumitru led police to the construction site. Excavation teams worked for 2 days before finding Rebecca's body exactly where he'd described. The medical examiner's report confirmed what Dumitru had admitted. Rebecca had endured repeated sexual assault and physical abuse over the course of 11 days. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, likely sustained during one of the assaults. Both Ionescu and Dumitru were charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. The case against them was overwhelming. The DNA evidence from the van, the basement room, the surveillance frame showing Rebecca in the building, the confession, and the recovery of her body. The trial began in August 2025. David Hartman and the couple's children attended every day, sitting in the front row, forcing the defendants to see the family they'd destroyed. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically: the timeline of Rebecca's disappearance, the suspects' access to the Hartman home, the hair found in their van, the abandoned building with electricity mysteriously activated, the single frame recovered from the surveillance camera showing Rebecca in distress, the basement room where she'd been held, the construction site where her body had been buried. Ionescu and Dumitru's defense attorneys tried to argue that one defendant had been more culpable than the other, but the evidence showed both had participated in every aspect of the crime. Both had planned it. Both had carried it out. Both had kept Rebecca captive. Both had assaulted her. Both had concealed her death. The jury convicted both men on all counts. Each was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, David Hartman addressed the court. He spoke about Rebecca, her dedication to her children, her work in education, her kindness to everyone, including the 2 men who would ultimately kill her. "My wife let these men into our home," David said. "She trusted them to do work in our house. She offered them water on hot days. She treated them with respect. And they used that access, that trust, to plan her kidnapping. They took her from our home while our children were at school. They held her for 11 days. They tortured her. They killed her. And then they buried her under concrete like she was garbage." He turned to look directly at Ionescu and Dumitru. "You destroyed our family. My children lost their mother. I lost my wife. And for what? What did you gain from this? Nothing. You threw away your own lives to take hers. I hope you spend every day in prison thinking about what you did. I hope you never have a moment of peace." The single frame recovered from the surveillance camera, the image of Rebecca standing outside the elevator showing the trauma of what she'd endured, was shown during the trial but has never been released to the public. It remains sealed in evidence, a frozen moment capturing Rebecca's suffering and her failed attempt to escape. Investigators later determined that Rebecca had managed to break out of the basement room at least once during her captivity. The frame captured her at what must have been a moment of desperate hope. She'd gotten free, had made it to the elevator, thought perhaps she could reach the ground floor and escape the building. But Ionescu and Dumitru had caught her before the elevator arrived. They'd dragged her back to the basement. And after that escape attempt, they'd secured the room more carefully, ensuring she couldn't get out again. The abandoned office building where Rebecca was held has since been demolished. The construction site where her body was buried completed its project, unaware for weeks that they'd poured concrete over a grave. David Hartman still lives in the family home with his children, though they've moved to different bedrooms, unable to sleep in the spaces they occupied when their mother was taken. The work the suspects had done in the home has been completely redone by a different contractor. David couldn't stand to look at anything those men had touched. Rebecca's children, now 15 and 13, are in therapy, trying to process not just the loss of their mother, but the manner in which she was taken and killed. Their father tells them that their mother fought to survive, that the single frame proves she tried to escape, that she never stopped trying to come back to them. The case highlighted the vulnerability of people who allow contractors and workers into their homes. Background checks and references are important, but they don't always reveal who someone truly is or what they're capable of. Rebecca Hartman had done nothing wrong. She'd hired workers to do some work on her house. She'd been kind to them, and they'd used that access to plan and execute her kidnapping, keeping her captive in an abandoned building while her family desperately searched for her. A single frame from a surveillance camera, one photograph that survived when all other footage had been overwritten, was enough to expose what Ionescu and Dumitru had done. Without that image, police might never have known Rebecca had been in that building. The suspects might never have confessed. Rebecca's body might never have been found. If you're hiring contractors or workers for your home, trust your instincts, check references thoroughly, and if something feels wrong, speak up. Rebecca Hartman's family wants her remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, as a devoted mother, a dedicated educator, and a woman who saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Subscribe for in-depth true crime investigations. Click the suggested videos for more cases where evidence almost disappeared, but justice prevailed. And remember, one piece of evidence, one photograph, one witness can make all the difference.